Len.
Thanks, David. If I can actually start by following up a comment by Elan. In fact, the Commissioner for the Environment for the last 5 years has consistently commented on the poor quality of the cohesiveness of environment statistics in New Zealand and how we fail to do anything about it. I'll also add a wee comment in terms of our ability to challenge ourselves. When Subaru went down the road, like so many independent institutions in New Zealand did, I hired a former senior Treasury official to write a report on why do we lose bodies like the Planning Council and so many others. And the title of it was For Whom the Bell Tolls, and it's available on the web. But I think it's just a general feeling that in New Zealand, we're not really that good at challenging ourselves. What I'm going to focus on two things. Are we really using the evidence we've got about our populations? We're talking about the population issues that we face here. And secondly, how we actually respond coherently and consistently to what we might anticipate. I mean, if Three Waters is an example of how long it takes us to think about one of the programs for what need to be an issue that seems to be getting closer and closer to us, we've clearly got some major issues. Just better find out how I now move to why is population change so important? Well, firstly, it's particular groups dominate arguments about fairness, equity, and incentives. And we also need to have an understanding of our history because it influences our future of the generational, sex, and ethnicity, and place. It also affects the social structure, which influences, again, the long-term viability of the tax and benefit system. And obviously, as we have a population which is aging significantly, I'm going to address that a little bit. I'll make one point that from the early 1950s until the end of Stats New Zealand's current forecast of 2073, the annual number of births that we've had ranges roughly around 60,000. And that means when we had a population of 2 million in the late 50s, we had 60,000 births. We expect to have 5.5 million in another 15 years' time, and we're still having 60,000 births. So the opportunity cost of failing to properly care for and educate, develop our children increases each generation. So we need to ensure that the economic contribution of each new generation is optimized. And obviously, as we have an increasingly aging population and the cost of that, we need to make sure, therefore, that the costs of looking after the older population isn't traded off against how we invest in the next generation. Just a little chart of the population of New Zealand from 91 for the next 80 years. The dotted blue line is the number of people under 14, and you can see that that's never going to reach 1 million. The two lines that are interesting, the red line, which is people over 75, and people between 65 and 74, you can see that in 15 years' time, we will actually have more people over 75 than under 75 that are in the retired population. I'll show you a chart later on the disproportionate effect of that on, for example, health costs. You can also see another important crossover in 20 years' time when the workforce more of it will be aged over 40 than under 40. So the other important crossover is really about now, where the population that's over 65 is larger than the population that's under 15. So we're starting to see some quite significant transitions in our economy. What I'm going to do is then just show you some of the effects of that. The first thing is just a wee short lesson in demography, that we can see that we have numerical aging. That's simply that we get more elderly in the population. I'm not sure I'm going to like the word elderly in a while. We also look at structural aging, where in fact the proportions who are elderly, and as noted, that's primarily caused by falling birth rates. But also what we also have in New Zealand is quite a high outmigration of young people. When we look at people between 20 and 30, that's when our major net outmigration occurs in New Zealanders. We have an actual decline, more elderly than children, and an absolute decline where even replacement migration can't replace the lost births. Now, why I put that there is that at a national level, we can perhaps point where we may well be, which is structural ageing. But in fact, locally, there will be parts of New Zealand that are already in an absolute decline and parts which are in a natural decline. And in fact, so really interesting work that Natalie Jackson, one of our leading demographers, did. I haven't got the 2018 census here for some obvious reasons. What she did after the 2011 census is pointed out the number of territorial local authorities in New Zealand that will have fewer labour market entrants than exits. And you can see that that is rising to about 84% now. And of course, this is entirely consistent with what we're reading in the newspapers of people in large parts of New Zealand crying out for young people for their workforce. And so I guess my critical point here is all this is predictable. We knew this, and we do very little about it. We may not be able to do much about it, but we're not even too good about thinking about it. I must admit, I did a job for the Minister of Health in 2009 on the age distribution of New Zealand nurses. And anyone that read that report in 2009 would not be surprised about what are the issues now of nursing in New Zealand. Again, when we discuss the future of New Zealand and its demographic structures, we tend to do very little. Just a quick update on how we've actually changed in fertility. You can see there that in the 1960s, the prime age of women having babies was 20 to 29 in the 30s. You can see now that the prime age has shifted up from 25 to 35. There's an interesting shift because if the median age of having a baby is under 25, then that means over a 100-year period, you have 4 waves of babies being born. If that median age moves up to the mid-30s, then over 100 years, you have 3 waves. So fertility rates may not have changed, but the actual momentum of population change in the population has. And you can see here that this will please Bert Walker from the 1970s. Teenage pregnancies have dropped down so that you've now got a lower chance of a teenager having a baby than you have of a woman between 40 and 44. This is just a really important chart which tells us for each generation born since 1921, what is our current view of their survivorship. The survivorship figures for the later generations are predicted or projected based on current experiences. But what you can see is that the survivorship to 95, for example, has shifted from barely 3% to 30% for the generation born in 2020. What's interesting here is that around 1970, 1980s, that's when life expectancy for people over 65 started to increase. Most of our population growth until 1970 was driven by the post-war baby boom and was formed primarily by a massive influx of babies. Most of our population change now and over the next 20 years is coming from people like me who are over 65, actually living longer than we would have done earlier. And so our population growth, these charts on the right for 75, 80, just show you the sheer scale of the impact of increased life expectancy on the older population of New Zealand. These figures ought to frighten you a little bit. If you look at, this is some old figures, but I haven't been able to find a more recent analysis of annual health costs of people by age. This is a very comprehensive analysis rather than the more simple figures that come out of the health system more frequently. This is a study of all per capita health costs of males and females, and it's about the current figure will be about twice that. And you can see I put the national super amount at that time in, and so for a male aged 95, then the extra cost will be not just national super, but the total cost will be 3 times the equivalent of national super if we're looking at their health as well. And why these figures are important is that we need to understand how do we manage and think about the demographic change. The first demographic change we had from the post-war baby boom was when the baby boomers stopped, birth stopped increasing. We got a huge benefit from their participation in the workforce. The second one comes from as we increase the educational competence and the employment ability of the workforce, and that's what we would call our second demographic dividend, when the people in the workforce are able to be more productive, a higher added value. Again, the previous talk, I think, would have left us with some interesting reservations, especially when you drive past the wharves and you see the same number of logs on our wharves now as there were 50 years ago. In fact, I gave a paper when I left New Zealand in 2000, pointing out that after 15 years of the economic reforms that Roger Douglas produced, our economic fortunes seem to be more dependent on the climate than anything else of the year. And so we're still a low wage economy. So we've got a huge potential to benefit from the second demographic dividend still, but whether we're doing enough to exploit it. And the third is the untapped work capacity of older persons. Can we actually get people over 65 working? And of course, we know now that our rate of participation in the workforce of people over 65 is second or I think third in the world, with only the United States, the most significant one ahead of us. So we're already at a peak level in that. Now, here's a little ratio where what I've done is I've taken my economic contribution ratio is when I weight the costs of education and the costs of supporting someone over 65, and then I put a value on their workforce contribution. And you can see that the economic potential of the New Zealand population was actually maximised about 2006 to 2010, and that basically we're on a path for about a 35% decline over the years to 2040. Unless we actually lift our game in terms of the education of the population, we lift our game in terms of productivity. And this contribution point, I think, is not really being well factored in terms of the demands that the previous speakers have pointed out to us in terms of the capacity of the economy to adapt. The dotted line, by the way, is the number of people, as the ratio of the people in the workforce to people under 17. But the dashed line is the ratio of people in the workforce to the people over 65. And you can see that that ratio is declining quite significantly. So we really do have to factor in demographic analysis a bit more significantly. I've just taken the Stats New Zealand population projections to 2073, and this is really stretching this analysis. But I've done it just to point out that if you go further out, we're still on a declining trend. There isn't a reversing of this at a later stage. Just when I look at just a brief foray into the Maori population, Maori have a very different demography than New Zealand. In 1966, for example, half the Maori population was under 15. And what we're seeing now is that over the last 50 years, the age distribution of the Maori population is now much more like the European population was in the mid-60s. But you can see that the economic contribution of the Maori population's age distribution is going to stay roughly steady, declining a little bit, while the non-Maori population is going to decline significantly, as I noted. So we're going to see a really interesting shift in the contribution of Maori to the labour force in New Zealand. I won't go to this, but this is just a reminder of the structure of that population until the early 2000s. For every Maori under 17, there were about 20 over 65. Oh, sorry, every Maori over 65 were about 20 under 16, partly because of the very high mortality of the Maori population. And that was exacerbated by their very high fertility after the 50s. But I won't go to that, but this is just pointing out where the workforce in New Zealand and how it's shifting in terms of the share of the Maori population is part of it. So Maori are playing a really significant part of our population growth in the younger parts of the workforce. And again, the importance of equity and access to education is going to have a huge impact on the overall economic potential of New Zealand. Just a wee bit of a reminder of our workforce. This is where we're already at quite high workforce participation rates, 60 to 64. You might recall this point here was when we changed the age from 60 to 65 of national super, and that had a huge impact on both males and females on workforce participation. Interestingly enough, if we shifted it to 60, 70, would we still see that for 65 to 69, would we get that same scale of lift? Is quite a significant question. Just a little reminder that our populations are hugely different in their growth potential. So we have the Maori population and the Samoan population in the Pacific generally, while we have the Indian population generally and the Chinese converging on the European population. I think it's an interesting reminder, although these populations, the Indian and Chinese, have grown with immigration, it's a thing that we keep forgetting is that migrants also grow old. So that while we could import, 100,000 Romanian babies, actually they get old too. So we need to think twice about the assumption of immigration. Just a couple of wee comments. One is that the national measures of population change, as I said, provide a really incomplete understanding of the investment pressures from population change in particular places. That they challenge locally the allocation of nationally important services, and that actually what we know we can see in health, for example, areas that are losing populations don't want to give up their services. And we're very poor at managing the scale of services. Disinvestment is politically very different. And so, as we've seen even with Three Waters, the ability to manage change that involves tension between central and local government is very, very difficult. Just a couple of trends, and I won't go into the trends in wealth, but just to refer to the Treasury review. My quick reading of it, which might be a little cheeky, is that it does suggest a little element of complacency about New Zealand's capacity to manage through. And I think it's well worth reading the report. As you noticed, the purchase of carbon credits. Well, I reviewed for Transparency International their International Corruption Index, and it is interesting that most of the sellers are from countries that perform worst on the Transparency International Corruption Index, and the ones that are buying are the ones that produce best. And I just wonder whether we're looking at the risk we're placing there. Little reference to protection of the commons, the waterways, and the seabed. And ironically, the UN report focuses hugely on the inequitable outcomes and the inadequate responses. So I think there's a huge tension, as was pointed out by the earlier speakers, in terms of how we see ourselves and how others do. Just a wee cheeky comment as a former public servant. I think the centralisation drive of government since 87, 88 has really reduced our immediate and long-term responsiveness. The significant difference between places, they're quite distinct environmental issues and significant responses. The demographic dynamics are very different, and they've location-specific resources. And also they rely hugely on the quality of relationships. Central government seems to be driven by lumbering structural change, and has almost forgotten in many areas the importance of continuous improvement. The centralisation that's dominant has very little thought to local implications, and one looks at the polytechs, Three Waters, health and education. There's huge emphasis on standard solutions of call centres, internet, removal of local, loss of regional headquarters, and quite a down weighting, if anything, an understanding of local benefits, and a huge focus on contracting. And the problem with the contracting by central agencies is that they expect contractors to also be nationwide. So you might recall we have the oddity where when the Ministry of Education wants to get small school bus tenders, it actually requires a nationwide school bus provider and basically puts out of business local school bus providers. So that nationwide contracting exacerbates the centralisation. We've also got a fragmentation of knowledge, the loss of the DSIR and the Ministry of Works. This seems to have been replaced by international consulting firms. I mean, one has to wonder when Standard & Poor's want to tell us we need to spend 150 billion on water management, how much of that will go to them in consulting fees and advising on a standard Harvard advice. And I guess my criticism there would be, if one really wants to look at the scientific capability of the New Zealand government, we should look at the trends in communications officers to scientists, and the ratio, and the way that ratio has risen dramatically in favour of communication staff may well be highly correlated with meth use in the community or anything.
Right.
Yeah. Just to conclude, I think that we do have a real limited capacity to take from low-income households. 60% of the near retired have virtually no financial assets. When we look at what's happened to labour income since the economic reforms, labour income is reduced to under 50% of the total GDP in New Zealand. We look at an interesting report by the Productivity Commission on Housing. That orange line is the share of houses that are built that would normally be in the bottom quartile, and they were 30%, 35% in 1960 when we were building about 3,500 a year. It went down to about 10%. We were building 20,000 houses a year. So the number of houses that we have been building for low-income households has fallen dramatically from about 12,000 to about 2,000 a year. And we can start to see that when we look at the extent to which houses and the households with low incomes are spending such a large share of their income now on rent. The rent to household income, you can see, is up to 50% for the lowest quintile of households. Just a final conclusion of where's New Zealand assets. If we're going to have a wealth tax, then very clearly the bottom quintile is going to be paying a lot. The red, the black, were we to have one, would be paying it a lot on financial assets and occupied houses. And just as the share of them, we can see that something household financial assets, which is really not well taxed, overwhelmingly held by the top decile. Interestingly enough, you notice the most significant area of the bottom quintile is the largest share of education loans. So when government decides to increase its revenue from the interest rate in education loans, then we know who pays it. And just a little comment on the impact. I haven't got the 2018 census unavailable results, but you can see that the number of households that are increasingly of two families or three or more families or complex structure is increased quite a lot in between 2006-13, and if we had the figures, would undoubtedly have increased even more. I'll just leave you with a couple of comments. One is the legacy we've got is that government really knows less than it needs to about how to engage with the NGO sector. I did some work when I was in Subaru, and I think what we concluded is that government's relationships with the voluntary sector and that the accountability it has with performance measures tells them so little about NGOs that it virtually has no idea whether it should increase the scale, reduce the scale, or get rid of them. Its financial measures are really very little help in telling them of the real added value of any institution. We've got a weak history of the systematic application of well-organised management practices. We seem to have replaced structural reform as a replacement to continuous improvement. And of course, we have a weak sharing of experiences. So I guess to my conclusion, here's a wonderful cartoon by David Lowe in the 1930s when he was looking at what was going on in the monetary system. And his comment was basically, gosh, that's a nasty problem. However, the problem's not happening at our end of the boat. And to me, that cartoon brilliantly describes my sense of our knowledge base in dealing with environment. Thank you very much.